We are not doctors. This podcast is not medical advice. These are the personal experiences of the host and guests. Your experiences may differ. The host and guests of this podcast will be discussing difficult topics that include death, dying, trauma, and emotional distress. It is intended for mature audiences.
The Martial Heart Podcast.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the inaugural episode of the Martial Heart Podcast. I'm your host, Ross, and I'm going to tell you from the beginning, I have no idea what I'm doing. None whatsoever. I've never done a podcast before. I've done a little bit of voice work in the past, but nothing like this, and I really have no idea what I'm doing, but I thought it was important to start as early as possible following having a heart attack, because I want the followers or listeners or whatever they eventually become to have as much as of a real-time experience of understanding what people go through when they're having a heart attack and with their rehabilitation and treatment and so on and so forth. I wanted that to be as real-time as possible. So we are 2 weeks into this ordeal, and I figured I'm healthy enough now that I can do this. You might notice that my voice seems a little labored at times, and that's because I still have issues currently where it doesn't take a whole lot for me to get out of breath, and that's because of the damage to my heart, I guess, from the heart attack. So you'll have to bear with me if I take a lot of deep breaths occasionally, just like that. But anyway, here we are, and we're going to give this a shot and see if anybody wants to listen to it. Maybe it'll help somebody in the future who might not understand what's going on with them. So a little bit about me. Some of you may already know me or know of me. I am a writer, and I have written articles online for print publications, for my own websites and things like that. I've also written a few books, mostly just fun, incredibly violent, old school action thriller type books. I haven't written one in quite a few years, but that's a different story. I am a military veteran, a disabled military veteran. I am a member of the VFW, and I served in both the Army and the Navy. But my physical fitness issues throughout my life started at an early age. I was a small, skinny kid, so I have, since probably the age of 11 or 12, realized that I needed to get bigger and stronger. So I spent a lot of time, decades in fact, working on getting bigger and stronger. But I also started studying martial arts at the age of 11. And that was my loving mother and John Robertson's mother were kind enough to drive us. At the time, we lived in Oklahoma, so it would drive us for an hour to get to Oklahoma City so that we could go to Jack Hong's Taekwondo studio. At the time, Master Jack Hong, and if I'm not mistaken, back in those days, he was the highest-ranking Taekwondo black belt in the United States at the time. He eventually became Grandmaster Jack Hong, and he has since passed away. But they would drive us all the way up there to go take Taekwondo lessons, which I loved, and I had a love for the martial arts from an early age. That wasn't my first experience with the martial arts. Believe it or not, my first experience was sending, I think it was $5 that I earned mowing lawns and stuff, to an ad in the back of a magazine. And in this ad, they were going to send you a basic karate instructions. And it was a book. It was self-published kind of thing. It was really just pages stapled together. It wasn't really a book. It was just something some guy was putting together, some karate guy. And it taught basic techniques, just a basic punch, a basic block, basic kicks, basic stances, and all of those things that you learn as a white belt, essentially, in any karate-based martial art, karate or taekwondo. And I diligently studied this book, and I was immediately smitten with martial arts. And of course, at the time, late 70s, early 80s, action movies were all the rage. So, it was a big influence on me. And once I got my taste of actual martial arts training with Jack Hong, I was just hooked for life, and that was never going to change. So over the years, over the decades, I studied several different martial arts in different locations and different countries in a couple of instances. But I was moving around a lot. I moved around so much that I never really had the opportunity to stick with one style or one instructor for any number of years and get a black belt. So I had colored belts in several different types of karate and taekwondo. So, but I kept at it, and I went to the military. And of course, in the military, you learn hand-to-hand combat. And this was old school military hand-to-hand combat back in the 80s that involved a lot of eye gouging and crushing people's throats and stabbing them with sticks and things like that. The good stuff. And then later in my military career, with the modern military combatives or Army combatives program, which involved some more mixed martial art type of approach to hand-to-hand combat, which was fun. I got a kick out of that. That was fun too. But after I left the military, I had an accident. And that accident involved me falling down a flight of stairs and having a complete separation of my left arm. So my humerus bone was underneath my pec, which is not supposed to be there. And it was pretty severe. I damaged my elbow. I damaged the bicep. I tore the bicep. I have rotator cuff damage in there, but the arm would not go back into place. It took him 4 hours to get the arm back in place. It was a nightmare, and I was torn up pretty bad. So as rehab after that, I couldn't lift heavy weights anymore, and at the time, that's what I was doing, was lifting heavy weights. So I had to find a way to stay in shape, work on strengthening my shoulder, and things like that. So I decided that it was a good time to go back to martial arts training. So I found a local martial arts dojo and signed up and started taking karate classes again. Started as a lowly white belt. One more time, I even make fun of it as the lifelong white belt thing, because I've been a white belt for in numerous martial arts. So it's like a tradition for me to be a white belt. But I eventually, this martial arts studio also had a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu program. So I eventually, a couple of years later, decided that I'm going to do that too. So I was doing both. I was a dual track student, as they call them. I was doing karate and Jiu-Jitsu, and I just loved it. There was nothing that made me happier as far as feeling good physically and mentally. It was great, and I was having a really good time with it, but I had a couple of issues. I had a couple of medical conditions. I had a couple of injuries, and I would have to be out for a month or two, sometimes a little longer, to let those things heal. But in Jiu-Jitsu, I did participate in a tournament up in Toledo, the Buckeye State Grappling Championships, and came out of there with a gold medal, which was fun. My first and only Jiu-Jitsu tournament thus far. But I continued on the journey after that. And I had to have stents put in my lower body. I had peripheral artery disease. We couldn't figure out why my right leg kept going numb. And for a long time, we thought it was a nerve damage or some sort of a spinal issue or sciatic. But it turned out after a long time of investigating it that it was clogged arteries in my peripheral. So I had to have a surgery to have my peripheral arteries opened up and have stents installed. It took 5 stents to open them up. And everything was fine after that. I was great. I went right back to training, just a couple of months later, and was back at it again. And I started having hip problems. And so I took a break. And that's what brought us to the most recent time. I had just started going back. I had literally attended one class on a Saturday morning while I was working an odd schedule. So I went in on a Saturday morning to that class, had a good time, and I was going to be able to get right back on track about a week or two later with attending all of the classes once my work schedule leveled out. And so I was in that waiting phase, and I had a heart attack. I actually had 2 heart attacks. It was 2 weeks ago today. It was on a Sunday. I was doing yard work. I was mowing the lawn and plucking weeds out of the yard and just kind of minding my own business. It was hot, but it wasn't extraordinarily hot. It was mid to upper 70s. But we have these black acacia weeds that try to take over our yard. So you have to hop off of the mower and pluck this thing out by the roots and get rid of it, or it will just spread and spread and spread and be everywhere. So there was a lot of mowing for a while, and then you jump off, pluck the weed, get back on the mower. And I was almost finished. I was probably 5 minutes away from being done for the day. And I had this massive burning sensation in my chest. Now, I have heartburn. I have GERD. So there's, having a burning in my chest wasn't scary to me, but it was extreme. So I had to stop and take a break for a second and see if it would cool down. And then I started sweating profusely, and I had sharp pains shooting down both of my arms. And then I got dizzy and almost fainted. And that's where I was. And I had turned the mower off because I thought I was going to fall off the mower. And I sat there for a few minutes thinking maybe it'll go away, whatever it is. And it didn't. So I drove the mower to the house as quickly as I could because I didn't really understand that this was a life-threatening situation. But I also knew that it was not normal, so I had no idea what was happening. So I decided to get into the house because if I had just died out there in the yard, it probably would have been an hour or two before anyone found me. So I did. I went into the house. I was sweating profusely. I was panting. And, of course, my wife wanted to know what was going on. I couldn't really explain it to her. I was spitting because my mouth was, overwhelmed with saliva like I was going to vomit. And I was splashing water in my face, and I sat down. And that was the beginning of this whole ordeal. We didn't know what it was, though. It didn't really fit all of the criteria of having a heart attack. And we have a pretty extensive medical kit at the house. So we put a pulse ox on my finger, and my pulse was dropping down to 45 beats per minute, which is really, really low for me. And but that was heart attack number 1. So on the next installment, we'll call it episode 1B or something, I will explain to you what happened after that. But until then, we'll have some. This is experimental introduction and outbound music. So that starts kind of abruptly, doesn't it? So I will see about modifying that a little bit. But we'll see you on the next episode.